The hallway smelled of bleach and stale coffee. Marcus Ellis's footsteps echoed against the linoleum, each tap magnified in the stillness of the police precinct. He clutched his briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of every eye, even the one pretending not to notice him. He had come for routine observation, just another day shadowing the internal affairs unit. But the air already thrummed with tension. Ahead, Officer Dillon's voice snapped like a whip. "Move it, Negro!" He backed, shoving Marcus hard against the wall. The impact jarred Marcus's shoulder, sending a shock of pain that sharpened his focus. Dillon's laugh echoed down the corridor, a cruel punctuation to a silent hierarchy of power Marcus had walked into hundreds of times before, but never like this. Marcus steadied himself, chest heaving, mind racing. He knew the cameras were rolling. Every push, every word, every microaggression would be recorded, catalogued, analyzed. But in the moment, the hallway became a courtroom, a battlefield, a stage where the balance of fear and defiance teetered on the edge. "You don't belong here," Dillon sneered, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of unearned authority. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He didn't flinch. He catalogued. Every motion, every gesture, every betrayal would matter later. And then Dillon turned, confident that the display had crushed him, unaware of the silent witness ready to dismantle him. Not tomorrow, not next week, but inch by inch, in ways Dillon would never see coming. Marcus's hand brushed his pocket, where the recorder hummed softly, a single, unseen line between injustice and reckoning. The hallway went quiet. Too quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered in the long corridor of the precinct, casting intermittent shadows across the polished linoleum. Marcus Ellis kept his back straight, briefcase tight in hand, his eyes scanning every officer passing by. Most avoided him, pretending the neutral observer didn't exist. Some lingered just long enough to leer with curiosity or disdain. He catalogued every gesture, the subtle curl of a lip, a glance held too long, the half-smile of authority. "Move it, Negro!" The words cut through the hum of the hallway. Marcus stumbled, his shoulders slamming against the cold wall. Officer Dillon grinned, a predator satisfied with a casual display of dominance. Marcus's mind went still for a heartbeat, then sharpened. Pain radiated. Yes, but it focused him. He adjusted his grip on the briefcase, which contained not just papers but a small recorder blinking silently. Dillon didn't know he was being watched. "You think this is funny?" Marcus said quietly, barely audible over the hum of the lights. Dillon laughed, loud and cruel. "Funny? You're lucky I didn't throw you out the door." Marcus's jaw tightened. Every movement Dillon made, the arrogance in his posture, the way he leaned over a younger black officer, was a pattern, predictable if observed carefully. Marcus catalogued, noting angles, expressions, and reactions. The injustice was sharp, immediate, like a slap, but his mind operated several steps ahead. Dillon walked down the corridor, pausing only to bark orders at a clock, his shoes clicking against the linoleum. Marcus followed, silent, patient. Every interaction Dillon had with others, microaggressions, dismissals, thinly veiled insults, was a data point. A young officer flinched at Dillon's raised voice. Marcus noted it. A secretary bit her lip to hide discomfort. Noted. Dillon smirked at small, unseen victories. Noted. By the time Dillon turned a corner, confident he had asserted his dominance, Marcus exhaled slowly. His hand brushed the pocket concealing the recorder. One day, Dillon's confidence would be his undoing. But today, the hallways of power were still tilted in Dillon's favor, and Marcus had to walk carefully. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and Marcus knew, just for a moment, the weight of the silence around him. Every eye that averted his, every whispered glance, was a thread in a web of complicity. And somewhere beneath it all, he was ready. Marcus sat at his small apartment desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his thoughtful face. The precinct footage played silently, but in his mind, every word, every laugh, every shove from Dillon replayed in painful clarity. His hands hovered over the keyboard, fingers poised to timestamp, catalog, and annotate each instance of abuse. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Every gesture, every word, patterned, predictable. The recorder hummed softly from his pocket as he reviewed the moment Dillon had shoved him in the hallway. Marcus's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from strategy. He knew that evidence was everything. Dillon had power here, in the precinct, in the eyes of those afraid to speak. But in this room, Marcus held the balance. A knock on the door startled him. His neighbor, Tony, a community organizer, leaned in with a cup of coffee. "Working late again?" she asked, peering at the footage. "You're obsessed." "I'm observing," Marcus corrected, eyes never leaving the screen. "Patterns, behaviors. Dillon isn't just careless, he's systemic. And most people don't see it." Tony set the coffee down. "People see it, Marcus. They just don't say anything. Fear, self-preservation. You're documenting. But how do you plan to make them listen?" Marcus paused, scrolling frame by frame. He'd already begun noting Dillon's interactions with colleagues, the clerk who flinched at a barked order, the trainee who stiffened when Dillon smirked, the other officers who laughed nervously along with him, pretending nothing happened. Each gesture, a thread in a larger tapestry of intimidation and complicity. "I'm not making them listen yet," Marcus said finally, eyes narrowing. "I'm building the record. Dillon thinks is untouchable, and for now, that arrogance is my advantage." Tony frowned. "Careful. People get hurt exposing this kind of thing." "You already felt his push firsthand, physically, emotionally. This isn't a game." Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the tension roll off him. "I know the risk. I'm not naive. But what he does, isn't just personal. It's institutional. And silence is a real weapon." He went back to the footage, now isolating a clip of Dillon humiliating a black community member during a traffic stop. Marcus watched the man's hand shake, the shame etched into his posture, while Dillon barked orders and smiled at his own authority. Marcus's chest tightened. This was what systemic racism looked like: public, sanctioned, normalized. A notification pinged, an internal message from a colleague at the precinct. "Be careful shadowing Dillon. He's getting reckless," it read. Marcus smiled faintly. "Reckless, yes, but predictable too. Every abusive gesture, every word, every moment of unchecked power left a trail." He printed screenshots, highlighted timestamps, and organized notes meticulously. Each interaction was a building block, a testament to both abuse and resilience. Dillon had underestimated him in the hallway, and he would continue to underestimate him. Marcus leaned back again, rubbing his eyes. Exhaustion weighed on him, but the strategy was clear. Observation first, exposure later. And every moment Dillon acted unchecked added evidence to a record that couldn't be ignored. He thought of the young officer who had flinched at Dillon's raised voice that morning, and the secretary biting her lip to hide discomfort. Their fear wasn't invisible. Their silence wasn't permanent. Marcus promised himself he would not allow Dillon's arrogance to go unchecked. And somewhere beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and whirring computers, Marcus understood a deeper truth. In this battle, the eyes that watch, and the courage to record what others ignore, could be more powerful than the fists and badges Dillon wielded. He closed the laptop slowly, a weight settling in his chest. The next move had to be precise, calculated. One wrong step, one slip, and Dillon's power could crush not just him, but the truth he was trying to preserve. Marcus exhaled, letting the apartment's silence absorb his tension. Tomorrow, he would return to the precinct. But tomorrow, Dillon would not know he was being watched more closely than ever before. Every shove, every sneer, every misuse of authority was now part of a growing dossier that would eventually hold Dillon accountable. The recorder hummed softly from his pocket. Marcus's eyes flicked down. Dillon's arrogance was a gift he never saw coming. And somewhere in the quiet night, Marcus felt the faint thrill of anticipation, the calm before a storm that would expose more than just one man's cruelty. The precinct buzzed with a low hum of fluorescent lights and the clatter of keyboards. Marcus adjusted his tie and smoothed his jacket as he stepped into the Internal Affairs office. Today, he had been officially assigned as an observer for a training review, a thinly veiled opportunity to follow Dillon without suspicion. The officer didn't even know Marcus's presence had been formalized. Ellis. Lieutenant Harper greeted him, a clipboard in hand. "You'll shadow Dillon for the day. Document interactions. His under review. Just observe." Marcus nodded, a polite smile masking his awareness. "Understood." He trailed Dillon into the hall, noting the swagger in his step, the confident tilt of his head, the way Dillon treated every black officer and civilian as an obstacle to assert dominance over. "Morning, Ellis," Dillon said casually, not looking at him. "Don't slow me down today. You're just learning." Marcus's lips tightened. "Of course, Officer Dillon." The day unfolded like clockwork. Dillon barked at clerks, corrected officers with a mix of arrogance and condescension, and subtly humiliated a young black intern by questioning her competence over minor errors. Marcus documented every interaction, quietly jotting notes and adjusting the recorder in his pocket. "You really think you can handle this?" Dillon sneered during a brief corridor exchange, his voice low, a knife hidden behind a casual tone. "Not everyone belongs here. Not everyone has the stomach for it." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "I'm here to observe, and I see everything." Dillon laughed, dismissive, brushing past him. "See all you want. Doesn't mean it changes anything." Marcus's pulse remained steady. He had observed Dillon for months now. He knew the officer thrived on intimidation, on the silent compliance of others. But arrogance left cracks, and Dillon had left 100 of them already. By mid-afternoon, Dillon approached a community liaison meeting with a visitor, a black man in his 40s. Dillon's tone was clipped, condescending, loaded with barely concealed contempt. "You need to be more cooperative," Dillon said, tapping his pen on the table. "Otherwise—" His voice trailed, but the threat hung thick in the air. Marcus recorded silently, his finger hovering over the recorder button. Every flinch, every hesitation from the visitor, every smirk of Dillon's colleagues reinforced the pattern Marcus had catalogued: power wielded through fear. After the meeting, Dillon stormed into the break room, mocking a subordinate who had misfiled paperwork. "You're incompetent. You'd fail without me." "Sir," the subordinate whispered, voice tight, eyes downcast. Marcus remained silent. He was not here to intervene yet. Observation was a weapon he had chosen, and Dillon's arrogance continued to sharpen it. In the hallway later, Dillon muttered something under his breath, clearly believing Marcus couldn't hear. "They all think they're smart, but none of them know who's really in control." Marcus's lips curved slightly. Dillon's hubris was a trap. Every word, every shove, every sneer, documented. Every officer who flinched or averted their gaze added to the evidence Marcus would compile. During a brief lull, Marcus spoke quietly to a young black officer who had avoided Dillon's gaze all day. "You're not alone in noticing this," he said. The officer nodded, small but significant acknowledgement of shared understanding. By the end of the day, Dillon was visibly exhausted but still arrogantly unaware. He walked through the hall, chest puffed, believing he had dominated the day. Marcus trailed silently behind, cataloging everything, already drafting in his mind the way this day would feed into his growing dossier. In the elevator, Dillon smirked. "Good work today, Ellis. Keep watching. Maybe someday you'll be half as effective." Marcus's hand rested on the recorder in his pocket. "I'll see everything," he said, tone neutral but firm. Dillon's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Marcus caught it and filed it away. Confidence, arrogance. They were fragile when scrutinized carefully, like crystal edges that could shatter. As Marcus left the precinct that evening, he walked slowly through the parking lot, replaying each interaction in his mind. The day had been routine in Dillon's eyes, but in reality, it had been a goldmine. Every gesture, every microaggression, every dismissive glance was evidence. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the night, Marcus felt the anticipation of the next step. Dillon would make more mistakes. He always did. And Marcus would be ready. The morning air smelled of asphalt and coffee as Marcus followed Dillon into the downtown precinct parking lot. The streets buzzed with early traffic, officers in crisp uniforms moving between vehicles, radios crackling with static. Marcus kept his briefcase close, hand brushing the recorder in his pocket, a silent promise that every moment would be captured. Dillon spotted a black man leaning against his car, hands raised slightly, papers in hand. "Move along," Dillon barked, his tone sharper than necessary. The man flinched, stepping back instinctively. "Sir, I'm just here for—" "Don't talk back to me." Dillon snapped, stepping closer, chest forward. Marcus watched the subtle flinch in the man's shoulders, the tension in his jaw. Dillon's voice carried across the lot, drawing glances from uniformed officers and civilians alike. "You're wasting my time," Dillon continued, smirking at the power he wielded. "Cooperate, or I'll make this unpleasant." Marcus's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with urgency. Every gesture Dillon made, every sneer, every thinly veiled threat was a pattern he had been documenting for months. Today, it played out publicly, and the stakes were higher. The man swallowed, voice shaking. "I just need to file a complaint." Dillon's laugh was low, cruel. "A complaint? With me? You're not smart enough to handle the process. Step aside." Marcus stepped slightly closer, careful not to draw Dillon's attention, his recorder capturing every word. He noted the man's hands, tight fists around paperwork, knuckles white, the subtle tremor in his body. Dillon didn't notice. Arrogance blinded him to the cameras, the witnesses, and Marcus's quiet vigilance. A young officer, trying to appear neutral, muttered under his breath to another, "This is ridiculous." Marcus's heart tightened. This wasn't a single act of cruelty, it was institutional. Every bystander who pretended not to see it was part of the machinery that allowed Dillon to dominate. "You think this is public humiliation?" Dillon sneered, glancing at Marcus. "It's called law enforcement. Learn your place." Marcus remained silent. His gaze lingered on Dillon's smake, noting the confidence and entitlement. He catalogued the bystander reactions, the microaggressions of discomfort and fear, the small acts of passive complicity. Finally, Dillon waved dismissively and stormed off, confident he had asserted dominance. The man exhaled shakily, shoulders dropping slightly, but the humiliation lingered like smoke. Marcus stepped forward, voice calm. "You're not alone in noticing this," he said quietly to the man, who gave a faint nod of gratitude. It was small, almost invisible, but it mattered. Back at the precinct, Dillon bragged about the encounter to his colleagues, laughing at the lesson he had just delivered. Marcus took careful notes, already planning how this act would fit into the larger exposure. Dillon's arrogance would be his undoing. Later, Marcus reviewed the footage alone. Every interaction, every flinch, every small act of cruelty had been captured. He paused on Dillon's make, noting the casual, practiced cruelty in his expression. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was habitual, systematic, and sanctioned by silence. He documented timestamps, highlighted dialogue, and cross-referenced witness statements he had begun collecting. The patterns were undeniable. Dillon's abuse was not isolated. It was the tip of a structural iceberg. A notification ping from a community forum. Dillon's behavior again. Another complaint. "We're watching." Marcus smiled faintly. The net was widening. Others had seen it, even if they were afraid to speak. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Exhaustion pressed on him, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the clarity of his documentation. Dillon had no idea he had left a trail. Each act of arrogance, every public humiliation, had been preserved. The power imbalance was real, but now it had a counterweight. By evening, Marcus walked the city streets, replaying the day's interactions in his mind. Dillon's patterns were predictable, and Marcus had them catalogued, ready to expose. But he also felt the weight of what he had witnessed, the fear, the silence, the humiliation endured by those with less power. Justice would come, but it had a cost, and Marcus could feel it settling in his chest. Somewhere in the quiet hum of the city night, Marcus pressed his hand to the recorder in his pocket. Dillon's arrogance was growing, but so was the evidence, inch by inch, flinch by flinch, captured in precise, undeniable detail. Tomorrow would bring another day. Dillon would escalate, and Marcus would be there to observe, catalogue, and preserve. The first public humiliation had been recorded, but the reckoning was only beginning. The community center smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and paper, mingling with a faint aroma of coffee from a nearby corner. Marcus Ellis stepped inside, briefcase in hand, eyes scanning the room for faces that carried the same caution and quiet frustration he had observed for months. He wasn't here officially, but he had arranged a small meeting with civilians and a few officers who quietly resisted Dillon's authority. They were the hidden witnesses, people who had endured or observed abuse but had remained silent for fear of retaliation. Today, Marcus intended to change that. Marcus, said Sheila, a clerk who had been passed over for promotion, her voice low but steady. "You think talking to us can actually do anything?" "I don't just think it," Marcus replied, lowering his briefcase onto a table. "I know it. Dillon thrives because no one holds him accountable. But if we document this, if we strategize, that power can be challenged. Carefully, legally, effectively." Tony, the community organizer who had visited him at his apartment, leaned forward. "You've seen him at work. The way he humiliates, intimidates. People are scared. Marcus. They say nothing because they fear the badge, fear retaliation." Marcus nodded. "That fear is real, but it's not absolute. We can create a record that exposes it. Every gesture, every word, every flinch, it all matters. That record becomes undeniable." The group exchanged cautious glances. One officer, a quiet black man named James, spoke at last. "You really think Dillon won't notice us compiling evidence?" "He won't know until it's too late," Marcus said. "Arrogance blinds him. It's predictable. And every time he lashes out, he leaves a trace, documented, observable. That's how change happens. One record at a time." They discussed recent incidents, microaggressions, public humiliations, subtle intimidation tactics. Each person spoke carefully, aware of Dillon's potential presence in nearby offices. Marcus encouraged them to speak in specifics, recording dates, dialogue, and actions. His recorder hummed softly in his briefcase, a silent guardian of truth. "Sheila, your encounter last week," Marcus asked. "Describe it exactly. Every detail matters." She swallowed. He mocked me in front of the interns. Said I'd never be competent without him. Called me soft. I stayed quiet because I thought if I reacted, it would get worse." Marcus nodded. "That's why your record matters. The silence isn't weakness, it's documentation. Every flinch, every avoidance, every subtle insult builds the evidence. Dillon's arrogance is his undoing, but only if we show it." James spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You're saying all these little things. They add up? That one day it could matter?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "Patterns are more powerful than isolated incidents. And Dillon, he can't hide his arrogance forever. The more reckless he becomes, the more exposure he leaves behind. And we'll be ready." They spent the next hour reviewing small incidents, noting subtle humiliations and threats Dillon had delivered. Marcus guided them to precise documentation, dates, times, exact dialogue, gestures, witnesses. Every detail mattered. Every whisper, every flinch, every moment of fear built a mosaic of systemic abuse. By the end of the session, the group seemed both relieved and fearful. Relieved that someone had validated their experiences, fearful of what Dillon might do if he discovered their actions. Marcus understood that fear intimately. It was part of the environment Dillon had built, part of the control he wielded. As Marcus packed his briefcase to leave, Tony approached him. "You're taking a lot on, Marcus. Be careful." He's reckless, and now is aware someone's paying attention. Marcus nodded. "I know, but that recklessness is the opportunity. Dillon underestimates me, and that's the advantage I need." Outside, the city hummed with late afternoon traffic. Marcus walked slowly to his car, replaying the meeting in his mind. Every witness added a layer of strength to the growing dossier. Dillon's power felt immense in the moment, but each small act of courage, every hidden witness stepping forward, chipped away at it. He pressed his hand to the recorder in his briefcase. Dillon's next move would be his most reckless yet, and Marcus would be ready. Every microaggression, every shove, every moment of unchecked authority would be captured. Every act of cruelty left a trail, and Marcus now had eyes everywhere, not just in the precinct, but among those Dillon thought too intimidated to resist. And somewhere in that quiet anticipation, Marcus understood a deeper truth. Change was possible, even in a system built to ignore injustice. But it required courage, patience, and meticulous observation, the same qualities Dillon had dismissed in him from the very first hallway shove. Tomorrow, the battle would continue, but now Marcus had allies, and Dillon would begin to feel that even his arrogance couldn't hide him forever. The precinct hummed with a familiar mix of fluorescent lights and low chatter. Marcus Ellis moved quietly through the hallways, briefcase in hand, every sense attuned to Dillon's presence. Today, the plan would begin, a carefully orchestrated setup to capture Dillon in the act, leaving no room for denial. Dillon, as always, moved with arrogance, the authority of his uniform amplified by the fear and compliance around him. Marcus shadowed him closely, pretending to take notes while observing the patterns he had catalogued over months. Every gesture Dillon made, every tilt of the head, every clip command was already mapped in Marcus's mind. Ellis, Dillon barked mid-morning, pointing toward a paperwork pile. See to it that these forms are filed properly. Don't slow me down today. Yes, Officer Dillon, Marcus replied, voice neutral. Dillon didn't notice the recorder humming softly in Marcus's pocket. Marcus had coordinated with a few allies willing to risk the repercussions: Sheila, James, Tony, and 2 community members. They were positioned strategically, ready to witness Dillon's predictable escalation. Marcus had created a scenario involving a minor procedural mistake and a visitor known to challenge Dillon's authority. As Dillon approached the meeting room, he spotted the visitor, a young black man holding a file, and sneered. "And what do you think you're doing?" Dillon barked, stepping too close, chest forward, voice low but venomous. The visitor froze, hands gripping the file. Dillon's smirk widened, eyes scanning the room, assuming all attention was on him. Marcus stayed silent, letting the recording capture every word, every flinch, every involuntary twitch that revealed fear. "You're wasting my time," Dillon said, tapping the file against the table. "Cooperate, or I'll make sure this day is unpleasant." Marcus's finger hovered over the recorder button. Every detail mattered. Dillon didn't notice the hidden witnesses, officers and civilians quietly documenting the encounter. Each reaction, each microexpression, became part of the evidence. Dillon's arrogance escalated. He leaned over the visitor, towering, smirking, fully confident that the situation was his to control. "You think you can question me?" Dillon snapped. "You're not even supposed to be here." The visitor's voice trembled, but he stood his ground, repeating a procedural concern. Dillon's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering just slightly. Marcus noted it immediately, a crack in the armor. During the interaction, Dillon barked at a clerk who had accidentally misfiled a document. "How many times have I told you?" Dillon shouted, "Incompetent." Marcus scribbled furiously in his notebook, capturing the chaos Dillon created, the fear he instilled, the control he assumed over everyone in the room. Every action, every word, reinforced the systematic pattern Marcus had documented for months. Finally, Dillon dismissed everyone from the room with a dramatic flourish, confident he had asserted dominance. Marcus, however, had already downloaded footage from multiple sources, cross-referencing timestamps, witnesses, and recorded audio. Every angle captured Dillon's abuse, public, private, and recorded. Outside the meeting room, Marcus whispered to James, who had been discreetly observing from the hall. "He'll be reckless again. The more he escalates, the more evidence we have." James nodded. "But what if he notices? What if he retaliates?" "That's why we're careful," Marcus replied. "Predictable actions, unnoticed surveillance, multiple witnesses. He can't escape accountability if we play it right." Tony, positioned near the exit, sent a small nod to Marcus. The plan was working. Dillon's overconfidence blinded him to the network of observers silently documenting his every move. By the end of the day, Dillon's smirk remained, but Marcus noticed subtle signs of fatigue, cracks in his performance, moments where his arrogance almost faltered. These were the moments Marcus would exploit in the coming days. Each micro-expression, each raised voice, each flinch from a subordinate added weight to the dossier he had built. In the quiet of the parking lot, Marcus checked the recordings one last time. The data was intact, precise, undeniable. Dillon had walked into a carefully constructed scenario that highlighted exactly what Marcus had been documenting: abuse of power, systemic intimidation, and racial bias. Marcus exhaled, pressing his hand to the recorder in his pocket. Dillon thought himself untouchable, but every shove, every sneer, every humiliation left a trail. And Marcus now had eyes everywhere. The calm before the storm settled around him. Dillon's next move, his most reckless yet, was imminent. Marcus was ready. The precinct was alive with the usual hum of phones and radios, but today the air carried a subtle tension, unseen by Dillon, but palpable to Marcus. Months of observation, documentation, and careful planning had led to this moment. Every move Dillon made today would be captured, every word recorded, every microaggression catalogued for public scrutiny. Dillon entered the meeting room with his usual swagger, chest puffed, assuming control over the gathered officers and civilians. "All right," he barked. "We're reviewing compliance reports. Let's make this fast. I don't have time for incompetence." Marcus, seated near the back with his briefcase open, recorded silently. Hidden cameras were positioned by Tony and other allies, capturing Dillon from multiple angles. Every officer present who had previously flinched or averted their gaze now watched quietly, aware of the network of observers surrounding them. "You think you can question my authority?" Dillon snapped at a junior black officer who hesitated while presenting a report. "I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive." Marcus's finger hovered over the recorder. Every insult, every intimidation tactic, every sneer was documented. Dillon's arrogance blinded him to the fact that the room was filled with witnesses, each ready to testify, each aware of his escalating recklessness. Suddenly, Marcus triggered a prearranged alert. The screens in the meeting room lit up with footage from prior incidents, hallway shoves, public humiliations, and subtle microaggressions Dillon had performed over the last several months. Gasps filled the room as Dillon's own actions were replayed in stark clarity. What is this?" Dillon stammered, his confident smirk faltering. This can't." A community liaison stood, voice steady. "This is exactly what we've been experiencing. Your behavior isn't isolated. It's a pattern, and we have the evidence to prove it." Dillon turned to the officers, who avoided his gaze. No one defended him. The junior officer, emboldened by Marcus's planning, spoke up. "It's all true. I've seen it. Everyone has." Marcus remained calm, observing Dillon's unraveling arrogance. The room had shifted. Power no longer resided with the uniform, the badge, or Dillon's loud voice. It resided in truth, in documented evidence, in collective witnesses who refused to stay silent. You can't do this," Dillon shouted, pacing, flailing at projections. This is my precinct. My authority." Marcus leaned back, voice steady, though soft enough not to provoke Dillon further. "Authority doesn't give you immunity. Patterns of abuse are clear, and the evidence is undeniable. This isn't personal, it's systemic." Dillon's face flushed red with rage, every instinct to dominate overridden by confusion and disbelief. He realized too late that his arrogance, the same arrogance that had fueled months of humiliation, was now the instrument of his downfall. Lieutenant Harper stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Effective immediately, Dillon is removed from field duties pending review. These recordings and witness statements will be submitted to internal affairs and external oversight. A stunned silence followed. Dillon's smirk was gone, his swagger replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. He attempted to speak, but the room was no longer his stage. It belonged to the truth. Outside the meeting room, Marcus exhaled, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. He knew Dillon's downfall would not erase the emotional scars, the fear, or the systemic damage inflicted, but it was a step toward accountability. Tony approached him, whispering, "You did it. You finally did it." Marcus nodded, eyes still on the meeting room. "We did it. All of us. No one speaks alone anymore." The footage continued to replay on the screens, Dillon's arrogance exposed in painstaking detail. Each shove, each dismissive glance, each microaggression, a pattern undeniable and publicly visible. Dillon's colleagues, once complicit in silence, now bore witness alongside the community members he had tried to intimidate. Marcus's thoughts turned inward. The victory was sweet, yes, but heavy. He had catalogued months of abuse, observed fear, and endured humiliation personally. The emotional toll was real, and the scars would linger. Yet, this reckoning, the exposure of abuse, the shift of power, the validation for those silenced, was worth every step. Dillon, removed from the room under supervision, muttered under his breath, powerless. Marcus recorded silently, capturing even this final act, the unraveling of arrogance and entitlement before undeniable evidence. As Marcus packed his briefcase later that day, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Justice had not come without cost, but it had come. The system had faltered, yes, but the tools of observation, documentation, and collective courage had carved a path toward accountability. Outside the precinct, the city continued its rhythm. Marcus felt the weight of both victory and ongoing responsibility settle in his chest. Dillon's exposure was a turning point, not a conclusion. The struggle against systemic abuse continued. But now, the unseen witnesses had a voice. And Marcus Ellis, recorder in hand, would remain vigilant. The precinct felt quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dillon's removal from field duties had sent ripples through the building. Some officers whispered, others avoided eye contact, and a few dared to look at Marcus with newfound respect. The power dynamic had shifted, even if the system itself remained flawed. Marcus walked through the corridors, briefcase in hand, noting the subtle changes. Clerks held themselves a little taller. Interns exchanged glances that were no longer purely fearful. Even the young officer Dillon had berated weeks earlier now walked with a steadier stride. Observation had become validation. Silence had been broken. Lieutenant Harper caught Marcus in the hallway. "Good work," Harper said quietly, nodding. "We've already started compiling the evidence for official review. Dillon won't be able to hide behind excuses." But Harper hesitated. "It's going to get messy." Marcus nodded, anticipating complications. Exposure was never clean. There would be backlash, resentment from Dillon loyalists, subtle undermining from colleagues, perhaps even threats. Yet the documentation was airtight, and Marcus had witnesses strategically positioned. Later, in a debrief room filled with internal affairs personnel, Marcus reviewed the compiled recordings and witness statements. The evidence was exhaustive. Dillon's shoves, microaggressions, public humiliations, and dismissive authority, all undeniable and catalogued meticulously. A community liaison, present for verification, whispered to Marcus, "You've done more than just prove misconduct. You've restored some dignity to people who've suffered quietly for too long." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inwardly felt a swell of quiet satisfaction. He had carried the weight of months of observation, the humiliation Dillon had inflicted on him personally, the fear in the eyes of others, the small injustices others endured daily. It was heavy, but necessary. Outside the debrief room, Marcus caught sight of Dillon escorted by internal affairs officers. His face was pale, lips pressed tight. The arrogance, the smirk, the swagger, all stripped away, replaced by disbelief and a dawning understanding that the system he had relied upon to enforce authority had, in this instance, turned against him. Marcus turned to Tony and James, who had come to support him. "It's over, for now," he said, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the emotional cost. Tony rested a hand on his arm. "It's not really over. The system is still flawed. But today shows that accountability is possible." Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the weight of months of careful observation settle into quiet reflection. He had witnessed abuse, recorded humiliation, and orchestrated exposure. But even as Dillon faced consequences, Marcus felt the lingering toll. The fatigue, the tension, the moral weight of watching injustice unfold, these were scars not easily erased. Back in his apartment, Marcus reviewed the recordings one final time. Each frame, each timestamp, each witness reaction was a reminder of the journey, of power misuse and courage revealed. Dillon's fall was public and undeniable, yet Marcus understood it would not solve all systemic problems. There would be more arrogance to confront, more silenced voices to validate, more patterns to document. A notification pinged on his phone, a community forum discussing Dillon's removal, people sharing stories they had long kept silent. Marcus smiled faintly. The impact was real. The exposure had resonated, validating experiences that had been dismissed or ignored for too long. Still, he felt the emotional cost. The hallway shove, Dillon's sneers, the silent complicity he had catalogued, all lingered like a shadow. Justice had a price, and he had paid it in moments of fear, tension, and moral strain. He placed the recorder on the desk, staring at its small blinking light. It had been a tool, a shield, and a witness all in one. Dillon's arrogance, amplified over months, had left an undeniable trail, one Marcus had followed catalogued, and ultimately used to ensure accountability. Marcus leaned back, eyes closing briefly. The reckoning was not just Dillon's. It was systemic, emotional, and personal. The balance of power had shifted, if only slightly. The silence that had protected Dillon's arrogance was gone, replaced by evidence, witnesses, and a growing awareness that injustice could be challenged. When he opened his eyes, Marcus felt a quiet resolve. Dillon's exposure was a milestone, but the fight against systemic abuse continued. The moral stakes remained, the burden persisted, and the vigilance would never end. But today, he had made a difference. And in the quiet hum of his apartment, Marcus understood a simple truth. The cost of justice is high, but the cost of silence is higher. The city lights blurred through Marcus Ellis's apartment window, reflecting faintly on the polished surface of his desk. Silence had replaced the usual hum of tension that had followed him for months. Dillon was out of the picture, at least temporarily, but the echoes of what had transpired, the shoves, the sneers, the humiliation, still lingered, heavy in his chest. Marcus poured a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma grounding him. He thought back to the countless moments of observation, the young officer flinching at Dillon's raised voice, the clerk biting her lip to hide discomfort, the black community members enduring humiliation in public spaces. He had catalogued every incident, documented every word, but carrying them inside his mind had been exhausting. He pressed his fingers to the recorder, now silent and unassuming, yet holding months of evidence. It had been his shield, his witness, and his weapon, but also a constant reminder of the emotional toll of watching injustice unfold. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Tony stepped in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need a break," she said, placing one beside him. "You've been holding all this inside for months." Marcus nodded, accepting the warmth of the cup. "It's strange. The exposure is over. Dillon's reckoning is happening, but the weight remains." "That's normal," Tony replied, settling into the chair across from him. "You carried more than just observations. You carried other people's fear, their silence, and their anger. It doesn't disappear just because justice is served." Marcus sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing in thought. "I thought victory would feel lighter, but it's heavy, Tony. Seeing everything, witnessing the abuse firsthand, cataloguing it, it leaves scars I didn't anticipate." She reached across the desk, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "That weight is a testament to your humanity. It shows you care, not just about exposing Dillon, but about the people who suffered. That's resilience, Marcus, not weakness." He exhaled slowly, letting her words settle. It's hard to separate personal cause from professional responsibility. Every shove, every sneer, every microaggression, it imprints on you even as you act strategically, even as I plan, document, and expose. Tony nodded. "That's why reflection matters. You created change, but you also need to process it. The emotional cost is real, but it doesn't have to define you." Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the dark skyline. For a moment, the weight lifted slightly, replaced by quiet awareness. Dillon's exposure had validated months of careful observation, meticulous documentation, and subtle courage. But the scars, emotional, psychological, and moral, remained. "I've been thinking about the future," Marcus said quietly, "about how to maintain vigilance without being consumed by it. This system, it's flawed. It'll produce more Dillons. But maybe, with careful observation, advocacy, and documentation, we can chip away at it." "Exactly," Tony replied, "one step at a time. You've already inspired others to speak up, to resist silently, to validate their own experiences. That's more powerful than you realize." Marcus felt a flicker of hope, subtle but real. The struggle wasn't over, but the first cracks in Dillon's arrogance and in the system that protected it had appeared. The network of hidden witnesses, allies, and community members he had helped organize provided a foundation for ongoing accountability. He placed the recorder on the desk, fingers brushing the surface. It had captured months of injustice, and now it symbolized something more: vigilance, resistance, and the undeniable truth that abuse of power leaves traces, and that those traces can be used to protect others. Marcus sat back, taking a deep breath. The emotional weight remained, but alongside it grew clarity and resolve. Dillon had been exposed, but the fight for systemic accountability would continue, and he would be ready. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the internal battles waged within the precinct and within Marcus himself. Yet he knew, with quiet certainty, that small victories, recorded, documented, and witnessed, could ripple outward, creating momentum for change. He lifted his mug, letting the warmth seep through his hands. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a sense of closure, tempered by awareness. Dillon's reckoning had begun. Marcus's reflection had begun. And the work of resilience and accountability, both personal and systemic, would continue. The morning sunlight streamed through Marcus Ellis's apartment window, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm that wasn't laced with tension or anticipation. Dillon's exposure had created a shift in the precinct, one that reverberated through community and among those who had silently endured abuse. Marcus sipped his coffee, glancing at the recorder on his desk. Its small blinking light reminded him of months of careful observation, meticulous documentation, and quiet perseverance. Each recording, each note, each witness statement had culminated in Dillon's reckoning. The justice wasn't perfect, nor was it complete, but it was real, and it had a cost, both personal and systemic. A soft knock at the door brought him back to the present. Tony entered, carrying a stack of folders. "Morning. Thought we could review follow-ups from the precinct and community." Marcus gestured for her to sit. "Morning. Let's see how far the ripple has reached." The folders contained witness statements, internal memos, and preliminary disciplinary reports. Dillon's actions were under official review, and word had already spread among precinct staff. Accountability was no longer optional. Marcus noted subtle shifts in language within reports, less deference, more insistence on professionalism, more explicit acknowledgement of misconduct. "They are changing," Tony said softly, as if speaking to the air itself. "The culture isn't fixed, but it's shifting. People see that silence isn't the only option anymore." Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the documents. He had spent months observing Dillon's arrogance, cataloging microaggressions, and orchestrating a scenario that exposed him publicly. Today, that careful work had begun to alter the system itself, even if only in small increments. "I'm still thinking about the emotional cost," Marcus said quietly. "All those months, watching abuse, recording humiliation, feeling complicit by inaction at times, it leaves a mark." Tony placed a hand on his shoulder. "And it should. That mark is proof that you're human, that you cared enough to act, to strategize, to document. But don't let it define you. Use it as guidance for the work ahead." Marcus exhaled, letting the warmth of her words settle in his chest. He had carried the weight of Dillon's arrogance, the fear of those silenced by systemic abuse, and the moral responsibility of observation. Now, he could channel it into vigilance, advocacy, and careful guidance of those who might follow in his footsteps. The precinct had begun subtle reforms, policy reviews, training sessions on bias and microaggressions, and confidential reporting channels strengthened by Marcus's evidence. Dillon's removal from field duty had been a warning, a precedent that accountability was real. Yet Marcus understood that systemic change was gradual, incremental, and often incomplete. The work would continue. Later, Marcus walked through the city streets, the air crisp with early winter chill. He observed life unfolding around him, officers moving between cars, community members crossing intersections, children playing near a park. Each scene reminded him of the stakes, the human faces behind policies, procedures, and reports. He paused at a familiar corner, watching a young black officer adjust his uniform nervously before entering the precinct. Marcus smiled faintly. Small victories mattered. Courage, documentation, and vigilance had created space for confidence to grow. He had witnessed transformation already, subtle but undeniable. Returning home, Marcus placed a recorder in its case, now silent but emblematic of months of struggle and strategy. It had been more than a tool. It had been a witness, a shield, and a testament to the truth. Dillon's arrogance had left an undeniable trail, and Marcus had followed it to a point of accountability. Sitting back in his chair, he reflected on the journey, the hallway shove that started it all, the months of observation, the hidden witnesses, the public humiliation, and finally, Dillon's exposure. Every step had been calculated, deliberate, and morally fraught. And through it all, Marcus had endured, not without scars, but with clarity and purpose. Tony returned briefly, smiling. The network of witnesses you built, it's stronger than Dillon, stronger than Faye. You've started something that will outlast him. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of both responsibility and hope. Dillon's fall had been decisive, but the work of vigilance, advocacy, and systemic change continued. Still, there was room for optimism, a sense that courage, observation, and persistence could create real impact. As the city moved beneath his window, Marcus felt a quiet determination settle within him. The scars of observation remained, yes, but they were balanced by the knowledge that he had acted, that truth had prevailed, and that accountability, however imperfect, was possible. He lifted his mug of coffee in a silent toast to the unseen witnesses, the community members, and the colleagues who had spoken up. Justice had been served, and resilience had been strengthened. And for Marcus Ellis, the path forward was clear: vigilance, courage, and hope, one careful observation at a time.